Hussein is a native of Somalia. He is known for his publication in 1985 on Frantz Fanon. And since that time, he has been involved in a variety of endeavors, empowering people in different parts of the world. He left the academy because he felt he needed to play other roles and went back to his country to engage the peace process. He is essentially a psychologist, and that calling impacted on him such that he went back into psychology, now heads the Frantz Fanon University in his country, which he founded, and next year will graduate the first crop of medical doctors and psychologists. So, Hussein, it's your floor.
Thank you, Seth. As you talk about our first meeting at Logan Airport in Boston, it looks like it was another century, and indeed it was, a long time ago. So I'm very pleased to be here and to present on psychology in meta-colonized Africa, new challenges in a new era. And to present it at the first Congress of PAPU, and the need to decolonize psychology to serve people, particularly those whom Frantz Fanon had called the wretched of the earth. We in Somali society have been cut off from the rest of the world for two reasons. Firstly, because in recent decades, we have been overwhelmed by traumas of war traumas and tribulation, such that we continue to look inward, not outward. Secondly, because psychology and psychiatry, as I mentioned to you last night, are underdeveloped, such that we don't have really psychology organization or psychiatry organization as such. As I mentioned to you, we only have an association of one member. That's me so far. I am very pleased to find somebody who's come in sympathy and empathy this morning to join me and Dr. Wade Nobles, who is here, who volunteered to be a member in absentia. Hopefully next year, actually this academic year in November, we'll be graduating the first group of psychologists and psychiatrists at Frantz Fanon University. And Frantz Fanon University in all of Somali society generally, that is Somaliland, Somalia, Djibouti, in Ethiopia, there's the eastern region is inhabited by Somalis. In Kenya, northeast is inhabited by Somalis. In all of Somali society, Frantz Fanon is the one and single institution that is offering training in psychiatry and psychology. My presentation will discuss the following: the experience of oppression, quickly, in Africa, history in Africa, the use of psychology in fortifying and extending the history of oppression, and the new challenges awaiting African psychologists in theory, research, and practice. My presentation will build on my previous as well as recent works, in particular 3 of them. Firstly, my book on Frantz Fanon and the psychology of oppression. Secondly, my published article on imperialism in studies of the psyche, a critique of African psychological research. Thirdly, my recent article on stages of colonialism, from occupation of land to occupation of being. Time does not permit me to go in depth or in detail on these themes or topics, and those who are interested to read more of these can ask. I can provide reference to that. Many of you who have not read my earlier work will wonder what I mean by meta-colonialism. You know, you've heard about colonialism, naturally, you know, the topic on colonialism, and of course neo-colonialism subsequently, and even auto-colonialism in terms of the sword. But meta-colonialism, what does it mean? And I'll describe what I mean by this. Before I go further afield with these abstract and perhaps confusing terms, I must begin with a few simple and mundane facts. First, traditional psychology as an academic discipline or professional practice, shorn of its historical and cultural context, should never mislead us to accept on faith that it is developed, that it is a science developed and founded to serve humanity everywhere. It does not. Secondly, accepting uncritically this notion of psychology as science, supposedly serving humanity, can make us, without realizing, the unwitting purveyors of Eurocentric cultural biases and the convenient conveyor belts of values alien to our communities and in opposition to the interests of these communities. Thirdly, such a psychology can make us, again, without realizing, effective tools of Eurocentric domination. None indeed is more dangerous than lost souls who claim and believe to liberate people when they actually perpetuate their alienation, self-estrangement, and domination. Only when we critically examine the prevailing theories and practices do we learn the pervasive nature of Eurocentrism in traditional psychology. Only when we critically examine traditional psychology do we discover that even African universities still stuck with and propagating Eurocentric theories and practices may well be bastions of Eurocentric mystification, perpetuating oppression in the private and public lives of African peoples we claim to serve. It does not surprise me that my book, Frantz Fanon's Psychology of Oppression, published in 1985, is still going strong and sold because the themes or issues I discussed there 32 years ago are still, to this day, relevant to readers in different parts of the world. I revisited these issues recently when a group of North and South American psychologists invited me to contribute to a special issue on decolonizing psychological sciences. The theme of that issue as a whole was decolonizing psychological sciences. And it was published by rapidly growing journal called Journal of Social and Political Psychology, to which I am in the editorial member, and I encourage you to publish more in that as well as other journals, at least to counteract and to resist the Eurocentric aspects of psychology. I reviewed in that article the development of classical colonialism after the transatlantic slavery that you are very well familiar with proved no longer profitable. You know, classical colonialism takes over. Classical colonialism takes over, and then, of course, there's independence of Africa in the late, Ghana in 1957, subsequently in the 1960s, and thereafter, independence of Africans. In brief, slavery represented, first and foremost, the unremitting assault on the body of the slave, of the African slave, for what? In pursuit of profit, power, and European assertion of superiority. Power, profit, and European assertion of superiority. That theme continues, that pursuit continues in different forms. It began with slavery, and then it moves on into classical colonialism, subsequently neocolonialism, what has been called, and what I call meta-colonialism, which I will describe. So it was assault on the body. Subsequent to that, or simultaneous with that, was just not the body, but the culture, the language, the history, the identity, and so on. The assault continues. Then comes when slavery proved not profitable because of the Industrial Revolution and changes in capitalism, classical colonialism kicks off. That is replacing classical colonialism comes. And what is classical colonialism? As Fanon talks about it, first and foremost, it's occupation of the land. It's the economy first and foremost. Not so much directly the body of the African or the colonized, it is the land, because the land is where the economy is based, and therefore also the political power. Taking over the land also entailed, in classical colonialism, exploiting the resources of the land, finding new markets for products that are produced in Europe, and also cheap labor. Okay, so in a different form, the assault on the body comes up, but occupation of the land is the first and most important assault. Independence in 1957 in Ghana, and then subsequently in the 1960s and 70s in much of Africa, has begun to bring a new kind of form of colonialism. And as you know, Walter Rodney and Samir Amin and quite a number of other writers have talked about neocolonialism. Previously, as you know, Samir Amin and Walter Rodney of Guyana, in How Underdeveloped Africa, talked about the contribution of slavery to the development of Europe. Similarly, Eric Williams of Trinidad, later becoming very radical, remarkable man, later becoming president of Trinidad, had also written about capitalism, slavery and capitalism, a very small, remarkable book. Interestingly, when he became president, the joke has been in Trinidad. One time I visited, that he banned his book in Trinidad because it was just too radical. Okay, so with colonialism, an assault of the land went hand in hand, of course, assault on the culture and identity of people. But the primary first step was occupation of land. Now, psychology under slavery and colonialism has a remarkable and, remarkably sordid history in terms of perpetuating these institutions and justifying them. My books and articles present a detailed discussion on this. I just want to suggest that early on with slavery, the black slaves who, having found no means really to reverse slavery, and they fought valiantly in many contexts, but not armed equally, and they were forced, those who had the opportunity, to run away. And psychology and specialists in psychiatry have justified that kind of running as some kind of a disorder. Slaves who are disobedient, who are not doing the kind of work they are expected to do, and nature has actually, produced them to work for white masters, anyone who veered away from that was identified as deviant. And pursuit of freedom was seen itself as indication of some disorder. Now, this now surprises us because as we look back, we've come a long way, and there are many things to this day, we call disorder that in another century people will say, my God, those people were thinking of these as disorders. And that has happened. Subsequently, also in Africa, with classical colonialism, there is massive literature in which justification of colonial rule. Carruthers, for instance, in Kenya, who was running Matari Hospital for some years, has distinguished or identified a pathology in the African by nature, that somehow they are lobotomized Europeans, that they can't think intellectually or they can't think abstractly, just as if there was lobotomy, by nature produced in the African brain. Or at best, that they were neurotic children. And children, the language of children and neurosis has a long history. I don't want to go too far into presenting. These are things that you are familiar with. But interestingly, when independence came to Africans, the Africans were no longer as stupid and lobotomized as previously thought. But then the independence and suddenly literature was going on. Oh, Africans are really depressed. The white man left them by implication, and they don't know what to do with their lives. They don't know how to govern themselves. They just have, you remember the whole literature by, and Fanon makes a remarkable critique of Menoni, who basically came up with this idea that Africans were looking for some authority figure, parental figure, to take over. And for centuries they were lost, and then suddenly the Europeans come in and they provide what they really needed most, which is an authority figure, somebody to guide them, to lead them, to govern them. But he also says another thing. Europeans were stuck with this complex of inferiority complex. They just didn't have a way of solving this inferiority complex that consumes them. And so colonialism provided psychologically the kind of way in which, as Alfred Adler would talk about, the dialectics of inferiority and superiority, those who were suffering from inferiority complex needed others who can be less than them, inferior than them, and that they could feel superior. And so Menoni, just as he talked about colonialism, Africans really finding dependency needs fulfilled by colonialism, the Europeans also found some ways of being superior. Well, I don't want to go into details of that sordid history. You are aware of it, but I want to go into meta-colonialism, what I mean by meta-colonialism. Meta-colonialism, what is meta? A Greek word which has been used in different contexts, something beyond or above. Colonialism of the past is no longer there, but it's a whole other, more complicated, but doesn't have that crude aspect. It's much more complicated. Let me go into manifestations of meta-colonialism. To begin with, meta-colonialism, because it's so complex, it's not just the land alone. Meta-colonialism established the dollar and recently the euro not only as the primary currency of exchange, but also as measure of human worth. How much you own of the dollar or euro is also an indication of your worth, human worth, measure of your quality. And of course, if you are poor, anywhere, your currency is low, and if you are black, it is even worse. This is colonialization of economics, wealth, and self-evaluation. Meta-colonialism also dictates that international laws promulgated by Europeans are just and essential laws for civilized conduct. And you hear any kind of, it's very easy for Africans, for Asians, for others, what they do to be easily and quickly labeled not civilized. And so civilization and good conduct and humanity and all the great things are in the nature of Europeans, but the rest of us can easily slide into that ocean of non-civilization. So with those laws, you have colonization of individual and group behavior nationally and internationally. Europeans and their descendants today enjoy freedom and opportunity in space. And here, when I'm talking about metacolonialism, or in fact in my own clinical work, I look at a specific set of dimensions, not abstractly. I look at space, how people make use of space, how are they construct concrete kinds of things, the space in which they live, the space in which they work or they exist. So space is very important. Time is very important as well. These are critical dimensions in life, for instance, and there are others I'll talk about. Europeans and their descendants today enjoy freedom and opportunity in space, not only in their land, but also beyond, in every part of the world, and even in outer space. Okay, so that is expanded more and more, while for the rest of us it is constricted and confined. And if it is not constricted and confined, its quality, as Fanon very well have described, is ruins and, waste and destruction and so on and so forth. It is a place of despair and unhappiness. After nearly denuding resources of the earth, they endeavor to colonize outer space, including the moon and Mars, for more resources. It's not enough to first slavery and attack the body of the slave, then invade the land and occupy the land of others. Now it's not enough. Something else has to be done somewhere else. We're looking at outer space, which can be occupied and invaded. In contrast, space increasingly represents unfreedom and constraints for the meta-colonized in ways worse than described under classical colonialism by earlier writers, like Nkrumah, Samir Amin, Walter Rodney. For example, urban communities in Africa have become concentration camps of disease and death, with profuse shanty towns, crowded hovels, open sewers, pervasive poverty and filth. In addition, their lands and coasts are dumping sites of the West's toxic waste. Toxic waste, if you read the literature that is every year coming out, our coasts are dumping grounds for toxic waste, increasingly, and unfortunately even some African governments cooperate with that and get some money. And so, okay, so these are toxic waste, atomic as well as medical waste, with devastating and enduring consequences for the fauna, flora, and human health. This is colonization of space. If the dollar and the euro were colonization of wealth and measure of worth, this is colonization of space. Home, too, is no longer a place of intimacy and security for the meta-colonized. Economic forces beyond the control of individuals invaded to instigate conflict among members, caught as they are between confused needs and increasing wants, neither of which they can satisfy. Meanwhile, radios and TV programs bombard them at home and their private places with meta-colonized propaganda, mesmerizing people with images of material rewards and ostentatious display of European models of beauty. And so, you know, your own concept of yourself at your own home is invaded by these images of beauty and grace, which actually put you down. Bring to the home meta-colonial ideas and ostentatious display of European model, meta-colonial contradicting their culture and identity, while their parents live in crushing frustration in the workplace, or more likely suffer chronic unemployment. And how can you, as a parent, you are not employed, you don't have the resources. Your children bring, you know, kind of images of, you know, their classmates or others, or what they see in the TV is telling them the best life is to look anything but what you are as a father, mother. Anything but the conditions in which they live. And so they grow up very much already looking at you as a parent, you as an adult, looking at you, that somehow you are falling short. And of course they grow up with this sort of idea. The minority of Africans with access to internet, of course the internet is another big, my God, you know, quite an impact on the lives of everybody. You know, we live in a world daily that is other than our reality. You know, I mean, people are looking at what's going on elsewhere, the social media and the images that are being bombarded. You wonder, you know, what is being formed. We have no longer control of the direction we are going. Young men and women in the States, elsewhere, are coming up with programs making billions, you know, and we are mesmerized by the kind of images that they throw at us. And these new technologies are really technologies of meta-colonialism. And what is in addition, again, meta-colonialism, you are no longer isolated, private. Your identity, your movements, your discussions, your communications are controlled, or at least it is no longer private. It's everywhere. One can look at you. And then in some parts of the world, along with that are drones. And you know, my part of the world, we sleep at night and then the drones are going. Any place they can hit. And we don't have the means in which we can stop these flights going on. They just are hovering over you at night, you know. They get some news, you don't know exactly where they get it from. Right from Djibouti, they come and they fly. And the people don't have means to stop them. Some countries, I don't think they can do it in some, at least some countries. But in ours, we don't have the planes. We don't have the technology, not even the radar, you know, that's there. We've been too busy fighting among ourselves and not to think about ways of protecting. So it's a different world in which you are not private, you don't live a private life as such.